what is the most effective way to improving your UI skills when it comes to product design? Well, I've got 4 techniques that I'm going to share with you today. So stick around to hear them all, and the last one is going to bring the first 3 together to show you how to put them into practice in an effective way. So let's get right into it. The first one we're going to talk about is spacing. So spacing covers pretty much everything when it comes to interface design. Everything that you see on a UI should be intentionally placed to indicate how it's related to other elements in that interface. And spacing is the way to do that. So when we talk about spacing, it's effectively the white space between items on screen. Okay? So designers always advocate for having a great use of white space, and there's a lot of meaning behind that. So let's take, for example, if you have 2 items that are really closely related. So let's say you've got an icon and supplementary text to describe what it is. Okay? They're going to be spaced super close together relative to the rest of the interface. So if you look into it, they might be spaced by 4 or 8 pixels. And then if you zoom out, the rest of the interface might be spaced out by 24 to 40 pixels. Now, this is used to indicate relationship. So the icon and the text, by virtue of having a very tight spacing value between them, indicates that they are very closely related. Now, in contrast to that, if you had multiple blocks of content on a page, so the main content with a sidebar, header, footer, pretty standard layout on a page, you'll see that the spacing between those elements are much greater. Now, while everything on the page should be related in some way, the actual content blocks themselves tend to be more related than how close they are to the rest of the page. So you can use spacing to indicate this at a glance. Now, it's good to use patterns for this. So people are used to certain layout styles to quickly make sense of a web page or a particular product interface. So the more you can lean into those traditional patterns that people understand, the more it's going to be easier to get people to understand your particular product and make it as usable as possible. So getting back into the specifics of spacing. So as I said, it is effectively a way to communicate the relationship between elements. Now, the key thing here is to use it consistently, okay? So whichever spacing values you use, it's important to keep using them in similar ways so that people really understand how the relationships between things move and develop as they interact with the interface. The most effective way you can do this is by adopting a spacing system. So we're going to talk about the 4-point grid system. Now, if you're not familiar with what it is, try to take the idea of a traditional grid system out of your mind. So what I'm talking about here is the 12-point grid system that traditionally was taken from print and it's been adapted to web and is a way of having columns of content in order to space out your interface. So while that certainly has its place, what we're talking about today is the actual pixel grid. So everything that you design is sat on a pixel grid, whether you know it or not. So if we can keep it really simple and say that it's a 1 pixel squared grid across the entire interface, you can then start to see how things can be specifically positioned. And when I talk about things like the 4-point grid system, all that effectively means is we're spacing things out by multiples of 4. So instead of moving things 1 pixel apart, the lowest value we're going to use is 4. So the closest 2 items can sit together is 4 pixels and no closer. And then scaling that out, you can go up to 8, 12, 16, 20, 24, 28. There's an infinite number of options there to scale upwards. However, I will say, to get the most out of the system, it's best to choose around 10 distinct values that you can use to then apply that to your interface. And the benefit there is, of course, you don't have to use, hundreds of different values. Equally, you can start to reuse the same values in similar scenarios. So as I mentioned, if you have icons and text that are placed maybe 4 or 8 pixels apart, you can then have things like the heading related to that maybe is 16 to 20 pixels from the icon. And then if you had a button, that might be equally placed around 20 pixels away. And then as you go further down the page, there may be a table that this heading relates to. Maybe you use a gap of 32 to 40 pixels there. And then you can start to create a really consistent vertical rhythm for the content on the page. Because if you say everything is spaced vertically by 40 pixels, then it becomes very easy to scan through to predict how things are going to be displayed next. And if somebody's looking for a certain piece of information, they can quite easily scan through if they know how the content is going to be displayed in terms of that vertical structure. So if we think about how that grid can be used in visual design and product design, as I mentioned, it's good to use that system and then just reinforce it with similar components throughout the entire product. So if we always used, let's say, 20 pixels between a heading and a piece of body text, we make sure that we always do that across the product. So you've got that consistency and predictability for you as a designer, because you know which values you're going to be using in which scenarios. And then for the end user, they can kind of get that consistency and predictability as well, because they know how things are going to be displayed in future when they come across potentially a new interface, but with similar components, because it's all using that consistent grid system. So number one thing is get to grips with spacing and think about how you can use a system to improve the consistency and flow of the content. Number two is typography. So to complement that, we've got to think about the text. So the text makes up 90% of the content, right? So we're going to make sure we get that right. Now, there's a few different elements there. And the first thing you might be thinking is, which typeface or which font do I use? Now, this, of course, it could be the video entirely by itself, because we've got to think about the brand identity you're working with, the particular fonts that you're going to use to convey the right values and feeling and message that you're going for. So we're not going to get into the details of choosing fonts and typefaces. What we are going to talk about is, once you have that, how do you then create a system, again, around that typography choice to make sure that it is designed in a way that is usable, readable, consistent, and just gives your interface a very cohesive feel. So the first thing I will say is, use no more than 2 typefaces. There's no reason whatsoever for you to use any more than that. In fact, if you can get away with using 1, that's perfect, because it means it's just the variables are very much reduced in terms of how disjointed and inconsistent an interface might feel by jumping between different fonts in different cases. So try to think about that when you're choosing a typeface. But moving on to how you apply that and use the system, I will say the first thing that's probably best to do is think about how you can use a typography scale. So there are a bunch of different scales out there. And to be honest, a lot of them are useful in their own ways, but there's probably maybe a handful of standard type scales that you can use that you can then adjust your own use case. For example, I might start with a minor third type scale. So the process that this would look like is, I would take my base font size. So let's say 16 pixels. Now, we can talk about that a little bit. So there's often a recommendation that you don't go below 16 pixels in terms of the body copy text size for accessibility reasons. Now, this is a fair comment, and I do think that in most cases it's probably best to stick with that. There are some cases where you can probably afford to go a bit smaller, depending on the context, depending on the level of density and the amount of information that you need to display in an interface. And of course, based on your actual target audience, their requirements. And I think if you are going smaller than that 16 pixel baseline, it's always good practice to make sure that the user has a way of easily adjusting that text size for their personal needs and requirements. Well, let's say we go with that 16 pixels as the base size. If we put it through a type scale generator using minor third scale, you might come up and say that the next size up is like 1.2 times 16. So let's say we end up with whatever it's like 19.20, let's say, for example. And what it's going to give you is pretty much multiples of that 16 pixel baseline, going all the way up to give you all the different heading sizes, and potentially downwards as well to give you those smaller sizes where needed. So based on that base font size, you're going to get a scale of numbers that are going to inform the different sizes for your various different pieces of text. So what I will say is that, as I say, you may get these kind of decimal values back from these scale generators. So just be mindful that you're not locked into that. And in fact, I would recommend that you just take, let's say, 4 heading styles and potentially the body text you've already got, and then maybe look at a couple of styles for meta text and button text, let's say. So you might only end up with 5 to 8 different text sizes, which is, I would say, more than enough to start with. And you're going to want to do some rounding as well. So in the example I gave there, I actually came back and it gave me a heading size of 19.20. So the first thing I'm going to do there is I don't want to use these decimal points in my font sizes, and I would always recommend that you go for round numbers. So I would round up to the next nearest number on the 4-point scale. So if you look back then, think, well, we use the 4-point grid system for laying out our web page or product UI. It kind of makes sense to do a similar thing for our typography. So I would round that to 20. So then we're working again in multiples of 4 or 8 or whatever is appropriate, but tying that closely to the 4-point grid that we had and then whatever grid system we used, then it's going to give that feeling of cohesiveness that we're looking for there when it comes to the typography styles. So once you've got your base set of headings, body text, and supplementary text for meta and button copy, let's say, then you can start to really apply those in consistent ways and use them appropriately within your UI. The most important thing with that so far is with spacing, with typography, is that it doesn't really matter too much which systems you use. What is really important, is going to make the difference in the quality of visual design, is that you use them in a consistent way. So you could be using multiples of 10 or 6. I wouldn't recommend 10 because it doesn't give you much flexibility, but you could, and if you use it consistently, then that is the most important thing. Okay, the next up is color. So much like typography, in the early days, you're going to want to have an established brand color that you use for your product interface. Again, I'm not going to go into the details of doing that right now. This is more about how to apply it to a system that you can reuse. But effectively, you're going to want to have a set of primary colors that represent the brand of the product that you're designing for. Now, even then, I would say make sure that you go down to no more than 3 colors for the primary palette. Now, that doesn't mean you're locked into 3 colors for the entire product UI. We're going to have some supplementary colors for things like status and neutral tones for different areas of the product. But if you start with that core set of 3 primary core colors, then you can start to apply the rule that we're going to talk about now, which is the 60-30-10 rule. So this actually has roots from interior design, I believe, but it actually works really well with digital product interfaces. So in my experience, when I've applied this rule, it's always been really easy to kind of then establish when to use certain colors and have some reason behind that as well. So if we dig into it, if we start with the primary color, so that's 60% of the interface will be made up with this first color. So if you can imagine that, in most cases, it's going to be quite a neutral color because this tends to be the background for the UI and for containers. So it tends to be like an off-white or even a white, a very neutral tone that is going to set a good foundation for contrasting well with the content that goes on top. So 60% of the UI is going to use this primary color. So as I said, it tends to be a neutral color there to lay the foundation. Next up is going to be the secondary color, which is going to be used for 30% of the interface. So this is then going to be predominantly the text that sits on top of that primary color. So in many cases, those 2 colors might just be kind of shades of off-white and gray. But what that does mean is that you're going to get like a high contrast combination straight away. That's the first thing you worry about, is making sure that that text and content is readable and accessible and legible on that background. So once you've got those 2 in place, you're going to use the primary color for the backgrounds, the secondary color for the text, the icons, kind of the core content of the UI. And once those are in place, you're going to then look at the 10%, which is the accent color. Now, going back to the original kind of brand specification that you're working to in that core palette, the accent color is normally going to be that primary brand color. So let's say, we use it quite sparingly, but it has an impact. So by that I mean you're going to use it to accent the UI in places for buttons and CTAs, active states for tabs and navigation, potentially text links accompanied by an underline in many cases. Anywhere that you want to draw visual attention to, you're going to use that accent color. And the real impact it has can often be lost if it's overused. So you've got to make sure that you use it sparingly to retain that impact and the engagement and the visual interest that you're trying to convey with this kind of brand accent color. So once you've got those three in place, you can effectively stop there. Like you've pretty much covered all bases when it comes to the UI, but it might look a little bit bland in some areas, which is where I would say is to have that secondary palette, which I would normally have like a traffic light system in there. So you have your green, your amber, your red, or some combination of those to use for statuses and to supplement certain visuals in some ways. A side note on that, I would always say that you shouldn't rely on color to convey meaning. So always supplement that with a very obvious icon, or if you can, I would always recommend using text as the primary way of conveying a message, and the icons and the colors come secondary to that. Okay, and in addition to that, if you need any additional colors, I would always go from the primary palette and pick like similar colors. So use the same hue, but just tweak the saturation and lightness values if you need any additional kind of neutral tones to go along with that. So there is your color set. Now, the final technique I'm going to talk about is kind of building hierarchy with the interface, which effectively takes elements of each of those three areas we've just talked about and putting it together to make sure that it's actually clear and legible and helps to guide people through the interface that you've designed. So there are a number of ways to create hierarchy. And when it comes to visual design, the core techniques that you tend to find are kind of sizing, weight, color, and of course spacing is used to indicate that as well. So you can use a combination of those. And if we just take kind of typography to start with, you've got your heading styles. So you tend to going to have the headings that are going to be a lot more visually striking in terms of using a bolder weight, using a bigger font size. You may play with kind of letter spacing and line height to some degree, but that's for another video. Effectively, the idea is that you're going to draw attention to that. And if we think about the meaning of hierarchy, it's effectively all around showing a level of importance on the screen. So you want to make sure that the things that are drawing attention are actually intentional, and you're wishing people to look towards those in the appropriate way. And then think about use of color as well. So I mentioned that color shouldn't be the primary use to convey meaning, but it can be supplementary to adding a little bit of added impact where necessary. So it's good to kind of play around with those different values, use the systems that we've talked about here, and apply those in a way that makes sense for your product. So I would love to hear more about the types of techniques that you use, that you've used to improve your visual design, and that you use day to day when designing product interfaces. So let me know down in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one.